Hello, my name is Eric Willison, and welcome to the third video and final video in our study of the Second Amendment and the controversy about it. In the first video, we talked about a textual analysis of the Second Amendment and how that supports the idea that the Second Amendment protects the pre-existing right of the people to own guns. There were some policy arguments in the second video, and we're going to get into some more practical arguments in this, the third video and final video of the series. People who support gun control often want to make some sort of a distinction between sporting rifles, as they call them. Often they'll limit this to shotguns, and military rifles or assault rifles and things along those lines. It never quite made any sense to me that the Second Amendment was only about sporting rifles. I mean, you can sort of picture, if you will, the founding fathers sitting around, maybe if it was the wintertime, a fire, or maybe in some tavern, drinking some Madeira, and they're talking about, gee, we've passed this Constitution a while back in the summer of 1787, and that hot summer in Philadelphia, and now we need some protections for our rights, because now we've got this federal government, and some of us, they're called the anti-federalists, are a little concerned that this federal government may go too far. So we're going to maybe put together some protections. Well, who would like to start with some protections? And maybe somebody says, well, what about freedom of speech? And the assembled group gives you sort of the English, hear, hear. What about freedom of the press? Well, that's a good one, hear, hear. What about the freedom to petition government? Yes, yes, hear, hear. What about the freedom of religion? Yes, hear, hear, hear. What about the freedom from religion? Yes, hear, hear, hear. What about duck hunting? What? Who said that? Who said that? Wise ass. Well, why in the midst of all of this, these grandiose freedoms, these important rights of the people, would we throw in something about duck hunting? Does that make any sense? I mean, think critically now. Does that make any sense? Duck hunting. Perhaps not. Maybe it's something a little more important. Maybe it's something a little more aligned with the rights that these folks were just calling out through my rather imperfect acting skills. So maybe freedom of speech was a protection against tyranny. Maybe freedom of the press and freedom of assembly and freedom of the right to petition government. Maybe those were protections against tyranny. And maybe, just maybe, guns are a protection against tyranny as well. Who would ever have thought? Now, the gun controllers, they somehow got this notion into their heads, and they're trying to get it across the mainstream media these days, that there's no possible way that the founding fathers would have put a provision into the Constitution which would make its overthrow easier. They see that, they just can't see that. It just makes no sense to them. And that's because they can't think critically. That's because they forget about the Revolutionary War and how it went down. And the very first battle was at Lexington and Concord. And that was a gun grab. The military of the government went out to Lexington and Concord, to the armories there, and tried to seize all the weapons. And those who were there, the militia, heard they were coming and gathered in the square and said, "You're not taking our guns. It's not going to happen." Now, for those who would imagine there's no way that the Founding Fathers would have put something into their Constitution that would make overthrowing the government easier, their own government, who do they think these people were at the time that the Battle of Lexington and Concord was fought? That was, for all of you history buffs out there, April 19th of 1775. That was more than a year before the Declaration of Independence. Therefore, at that time, these were Englishmen. And whom were they fighting against? Englishmen in the form of redcoats. And they were fighting against Englishmen, even though they were Englishmen. They were fighting against their own government because they felt that their government was denying them the rights of Englishmen. You're not going to treat us like Englishmen? Oh, yes, you will, is what they basically came to the conclusion of at Lexington and Concord. These Englishmen were looking to overthrow their English government. And why were they looking to do that? Why were they fighting their own government with these guns? With these guns, these Englishmen chased the representatives of the English government all the way from Lexington and Concord, all the way back into Boston, with heavy redcoat losses. They chased them the whole way with their own guns. They were using their own guns to try to overthrow their own government. So why, a few years later, would it be such a hard thing to imagine that they would put a provision into their own Constitution, allowing them to do, again, what they previously did? Why is that so hard to understand? And that's because a government exists to protect the rights of its citizens. Now, the leftists among us believe that the government exists so that they can rule over us and tell us what to do, they being the leftists. But the real reason that a government exists is to protect the rights of the citizens. And when a government stops doing that, it loses its purpose. But worse, when the government, instead of protecting the rights of the citizen, actively is going out and is trying to deny those rights to the citizen, that's when it starts tyrannizing over the citizen. Look at the seal of the state of Virginia. It's sort of a Romanesque kind of figure with a sword, and he's standing over top of another person who's laying dead on the ground after being killed by the person with the sword. And just off to the side is a crown laying there on the ground, showing here was a king, a ruler of some sort, killed by this man with the sword. And it says in Latin, sic semper tyrannus, thus always to tyrants, is the Latin translation. It doesn't say thus always to foreign tyrants. It doesn't say thus always to invading tyrants. It says to tyrants. And those can be any tyrants, even ones that are in charge of the government that we have elected. Now, I hear these leftists, they'll always say, well, what do you really need an AR-15 or an AK-47 for? Because even if it is to protect against a tyrannical form of government, the government's got weapons that dwarf these. They've got tanks, they've got armored personnel carriers, they've got aircraft. You stand no chance against the modern military. Is that the lesson that the leftists have learned from Iraq and Afghanistan? You people arguing the futility of guns against tanks and armor and aircraft, you really don't understand what a motivated Marine and his rifle can do. Now, I was never in the Marines. I was in the Air Force. They would have called me some puke Air Force guy. But my friends in the Marines, pretty handy with those rifles when they're motivated. I don't think that can be denied. And there's a lot of motivated Marines out there, and a lot of them have rifles. So let's think also, though, about the characteristics of people who want to interpret the Second Amendment broadly as protecting a freedom to own and bear arms. When you close your eyes and think of these people, you sort of realize that their ranks swell with law enforcement, military, former law enforcement, former military, hunters, certainly, people who are proficient with owning, storing, cleaning, carrying, and using firearms. Now, let's think about the average supporter of gun control. We close our eyes and we think of somebody who has never owned a gun and who doesn't even want to touch a gun. If it were to come down to a violent dispute between those two sets of people, who do you think would win? Because there's over 300 million guns in the United States. And those who own those guns are not just going to hand them over. And no, the government can't buy them back because the government didn't sell them in the first place. And in the second place, even if the government did sell the guns to people like me, my guns aren't for sale. Now, another question that bears asking is, who are you leftists going to find what person is willing, or what set of persons is willing to go door to door in West Virginia and tell those folks to come on out and hand over your guns for confiscation? That's not going to be a job with a long-term future. What good is a weekly paycheck if you don't make it to Friday? Even if you could get through all those boys down in West Virginia, and you can't, then you're going to have to go through all those guys in Texas and Arizona and so on. Now, up here in Ohio, we're civilized. We'll compromise. We won't hand over our guns, but we will send over our bullets. But just understand, those bullets are going to be sent over at over 1,000 feet per second. And that's going to make it so that that smell of burnt gunpowder is going to be the last of your worries if you try to come and get our guns. But like I say, we'll compromise, we'll work something out. Now, and isn't that the real reason that you statist leftists want to get our guns? William F. Buckley may have said it best. He said that there's a lot of important rights, and I'm paraphrasing here. He said there's a lot of important rights in the Bill of Rights. You know, there's the First Amendment, Third Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Sixth Amendment, all the rights guaranteed there. But when they try to take away those other rights, so long as you have the Second Amendment, you can shoot them. So in the end, you know, if you don't like guns, don't get one. If you don't like men, date women. But I would advise you to date an armed woman. So that way she can protect you when you're fumbling around for your mobile phone to try to call the police when everything goes sideways. She'll be there to protect you. Now, I don't know if anything's going to protect you from that look of disgust that she's going to give you after the smoke clears. That one's all yours.